We think we know our past. But what if the truth buried in ancient bones tells a different story? A story not of kings and monuments, but of shattered skulls, torn flesh, and the desperate will to survive. From shark attacks older than the pyramids, to surgeries that defied the limits of stone tools, to sacrifices buried under grinding stones. History's most violent secrets are not written in books. They are carved into the skeletons of those who lived and died long before us. The question is, are you ready to hear them? 3,000 years before the first pyramid touched the Egyptian sky, a man stepped into the coastal waters of what is now Okayama Prefecture, Japan. The summer sun was high, the waves low and rhythmic, and the shoreline behind him was alive with the quiet work of the Jomon people, foragers, fishers, artisans. We don't know why he entered the water that day. Maybe it was to bring in a catch, maybe to dive for shellfish, or maybe just to cool his skin under the warm, salt-heavy breeze. What we do know is that he never came back alive. Centuries later, in 2021, archaeologists excavating a prehistoric shell midden called Tsukumo Kaisuka uncovered his remains. Labeled Tsukumo number 24, the skeleton was not just a body. It was evidence of an ancient battle between man and one of nature's most relentless predators. His bones were a map of violence. There weren't a few wounds, not even dozens. There were 790 distinct cuts and gouges, each sharp, deep, and purposeful. They scored his legs, arms, chest, abdomen, even his hands and feet, crisscrossing at strange angles, some curved, others straight, all carved into bone with shocking precision. These weren't the marks of scavengers or tools. They were the signature of teeth, massive, serrated teeth, slicing through flesh like wet rope. Forensic comparison with modern wound patterns pointed to just two culprits: the tiger shark, Galeocerdo cuvier, or the great white, Carcharodon carcharius. Both apex predators still patrol Japanese waters today, and both are capable of reducing a human body to ruin in minutes. But Tsukumo 24's story didn't read like a quick, chaotic strike. His injuries told of a prolonged, brutal encounter. The deepest bites were on his left leg, likely the first point of attack, suggesting the predator hit from below or behind. His feet and hands were missing entirely, probably severed as he thrashed and pushed against the massive shape in the water. His abdomen had been torn open, ribs fractured, chest cavity exposed. The violence was absolute. And yet the most extraordinary detail wasn't in how he died, but in what happened after. He was buried, carefully, deliberately, in a formal Jomon grave. His bones were clean of marine encrustation, meaning he hadn't drifted long in the ocean. Someone had gone into that water, pulled his ruined body out, and brought him home. To understand the weight of that act, you have to know the people he belonged to. The Jomon period, stretching from 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, wasn't just long. It was remarkably advanced for a foraging society. Named after their cord-marked pottery, the Jomon built semi-permanent coastal villages, crafted ornate ornaments from bone and shell, and buried their dead with care and ritual. They followed the rhythms of the sea with the precision of scientists, tracking tides, fish migrations, and seasonal harvests. They were no strangers to danger. Art from the period even depicts marine life, including sharks. But until Tsukumo 24 was found, no one could prove that these drawings weren't just symbolic. His bones are the earliest confirmed evidence of a human-shark encounter in history. And it's not the shark that makes this discovery important. It's the human response. Imagine it. Someone saw him disappear in a churn of water and blood. They may have been in a fishing canoe or gathering shellfish along the shore. They could have frozen in fear, turned away, left the sea to finish what it started. But they didn't. They fought the tide, risked the same fate, and hauled him out. They laid him on the sand, maybe hoping for breath that never came. And then, with the sea still dripping from his wounds, they buried him in the earth, placing him where the salt couldn't reach. This wasn't an act of survival, it was an act of dignity. In a time before antibiotics, before stitches, before even metal tools, death was immediate, and yet grief was personal. His grave tells us the Jomon didn't just endure their world, they responded to its cruelty with ceremony. The archaeological report that brought Tsukumo 24 to light did more than rewrite the history of shark attacks. It reminded us that violence and compassion have always coexisted, that long before humans built cities, they were already burying their dead with care. The predator that took his life has no memory of that day. The tide that carried his blood has rolled in and out 1,000,000 times since. But the bones still remember. And they speak not only of an ocean's first killer, but of the hands that refused to let him be lost to it. 31,000 years ago, long before the first clay pot was fired, before a single wheel rolled across the earth, before even the great migration waves that would scatter humanity to every corner of the globe had fully played out, someone in the humid, green labyrinth of what is now Borneo faced a choice that should not have existed in their world. The choice to cut through living human flesh and bone, not to harm, not to punish, but to save. It happened in a deep cast cave system called Liang Tabo, a place of cathedral-like chambers and shadowed recesses where prehistoric hands had already painted ochre images on limestone walls, recording animals, hunts, and perhaps stories that could never be spoken again. When archaeologists uncovered the skeleton in 2020, they expected the usual marks of a hard life: worn teeth from gritty food, healed fractures from falls, perhaps an infection left to run its course. Instead, they found something that should have been impossible. A left leg ending cleanly just above the ankle, the tibia and fibula both severed in a way that bore none of the ragged shattering you'd expect from an accident or predator attack. The cut was straight, deliberate, precise, the kind of finish you'd see today only with a surgical saw or an obsidian scalpel in a sterile room. But this wasn't a hospital. This was the Pleistocene, a world of stone, bone, wood, and sinew. And yet, under microscopic analysis, the exposed bone ends were rounded, remodeled, covered in smooth new tissue, the unmistakable signature of long-term healing. There was no trace of infection, no evidence of death from blood loss, no sign that this was a last desperate act in the final hours of life. Whoever this young individual was, likely between 19 and 20 years old at the time of death, they had survived not days or weeks, but at least 6 to 9 years after the procedure. 6 to 9 years of walking, limping, crawling, or being carried through one of the most physically punishing environments on Earth. Steep rainforest slopes, tangled roots, river crossings, heat so thick it stuck to your skin, and predators, crocodiles, snakes, big cats, always watching from the edge of sight. To survive this, they needed help every single day. Someone, or more likely an entire group, would have had to fetch their water, share their food, carry them over terrain they could not cross alone, tend to infections before they started, and protect them when danger came close. And that means this was more than a medical success. It was a social contract, an unspoken agreement that this person's life was worth the constant cost. The operation itself is staggering to imagine. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, no antibiotics. Yet the bone's clean edges suggest that whoever held the cutting tool, perhaps a flake of obsidian, sharp to the molecular level, or a carefully napped stone blade, knew exactly how to avoid the major arteries and veins that could have bled the patient out in minutes. They must have controlled bleeding with pressure, used herbal poultices with antimicrobial properties, maybe even bound the wound with woven fibers to keep it clean. And then came the hardest part, keeping that wound alive long enough to heal in a world teeming with bacteria. This required knowledge, not just of the human body, but of plants, tools, and time. Knowledge passed down not by books or formal training, but by watching, remembering, and daring to try again after failure. What's more, this act could not have been purely utilitarian. In a small mobile foraging group, where every able-bodied member's labor was essential to survival, keeping someone alive who could not hunt, gather, or defend the group would have been a net drain on resources. In the cold arithmetic of survival, the decision to perform the amputation and the decision to keep the person alive afterward make no sense unless compassion, loyalty, or some deeper sense of human worth was at play. And that's what transforms this skeleton from an archaeological curiosity into a direct message from the deep past. The healed bone is proof that empathy is not an invention of civilization, that cooperation did not begin with farming or cities, that even 31,000 years ago, in a world where nature killed without hesitation, humans were already choosing to protect each other, not because it made them stronger, but because it made them human. Imagine the moment of decision. The patient's leg mangled by an accident we will never know. A crushing rockfall, a deep infection from a wound, a predator's partial bite. And someone, perhaps the group's most skilled elder, kneeling beside them in the dim light of a fire, holding a blade of stone so sharp it could split hair, preparing to do what no one had done before and succeed. The air heavy with heat and tension, the sound of stone meeting flesh, the muffled cries swallowed by the cave walls, the smell of blood mixing with the damp earth. Hours later, when it was over, the bleeding controlled, the wound wrapped. The group must have watched for days, then weeks, waiting to see if the fever would come, if the body would fail. But it didn't. The stump closed, scar tissue formed, and life, altered, slower, but still life, continued. This is why the burial, thousands of years later, matters so much. The skeleton was laid to rest in a formal grave, in a cave that already held other burials, meaning this person's identity was not reduced to their disability. They were remembered, placed among their people with care, their survival itself a testament to the group's memory. And so, in the smooth curve of a bone healed 31 millennia ago, we find the first undeniable evidence that medicine, empathy, and community existed long before cities, kingdoms, or history books, and that the instinct to keep each other alive is not a product of civilization, but one of its oldest foundations. 5,000 years ago, when the world was quieter but no less brutal, the land that is now southern France held a small Neolithic settlement, its cluster of wooden huts huddled close against the creeping edges of the forest. On a morning when the mist still clung low to the ground and the pale light of dawn had barely broken over the horizon, the village stirred, not in the ordinary rhythm of grinding grain, fetching water, or tending to the hearth, but in the strange, deliberate stillness that falls when a community is united by a single, grim purpose. The air smelled of damp soil and wood smoke, the ground cold beneath bare feet, and all eyes were fixed on the center of a shallow pit, freshly dug into the earth. There, the body of a woman lay stretched flat, her skin drained of life, her limbs arranged not in the peace of rest, but in the vulnerability of exposure, her arms and legs outspread like the spokes of a wheel. Around her, the villagers worked with slow, unbroken movements, lifting thick granite grinding stones, heavy oval slabs polished by years of labor, the same stones that had transformed seeds into the flower that sustained them, and placing them one by one across her body. Each stone found its place with deliberate precision. One pinned her ribcage, pressing into the curve of her sternum, another weighed down her hips. More locked her forearms and shins. The final largest slab settled over her thighs, sealing her to the soil as if the earth itself was claiming her. The bones within her told a second, quieter story of a life of relentless work. Deep grooves where tendons had once pulled at bone, joints worn smooth as river pebbles from decades of kneeling and grinding, fingers warped from the constant grip of stone tools. But her end had not been the slow erosion of labor. The fracture in her skull spoke of a single, clean, and fatal blow. Swift, decisive, and without hesitation. There was no sign of panic in the placement of her body, no rush in the covering of her form. This was not disposal, it was ritual. The village gathered in a ring, silent but for the muted thuds of stone meeting flesh and soil, their breath misting in the cold air. The elders stood closest, their faces unmoving, their words, if any were spoken, swallowed by the morning fog, perhaps invoking protection, perhaps sealing a curse. What crime, real or imagined, had led her here? Had she been accused of witchcraft, blamed for a failed harvest, or feared as a bringer of sickness? Or had she been chosen not for what she had done, but for what she could represent, a vessel into which the village could pour its fear of the unknown? She was not alone in this fate. Across the scattered landscapes of Neolithic Europe, other graves tell the same story. Skeletons staked through the chest with sharpened posts, skulls shattered and mouths filled with stones, bodies laid face down and bound. The message was the same. The dead were dangerous, and without restraint they could return. In a world without the separation we now place between the living and the dead, death was not an ending but a transition, and transitions were dangerous. In her burial, the tools that had once fed the village became the instruments of her eternal imprisonment, transforming her labor into her punishment, her identity into her chains. Seasons turned. The settlement faded, the walls rotted into the ground, the fields returned to wild grass, and the memory of her name, if it was ever spoken, vanished into the silence of time. For 5,000 years she lay beneath the soil, untouched, the stones unmoved, until archaeologists' hands brushed away the earth, grain by grain, to reveal her exactly as she had been left. In that moment, the burial became a conversation across millennia, a whisper from the deep past telling us not only of her death, but of the unchanging human impulse to confront fear not with understanding, but with control, to hold it down, to press it into stillness, and to pray that by burying it deep enough beneath the heaviest stones we can find, it will never, ever rise again.